All right.
Good morning. Welcome to the Palmetto Literacy Council's virtual author panel discussion. This is our second one. This morning, we are very excited to welcome Barbara Evers and Rebecca Bruff. We are championing and celebrating South Carolina authors. So they are both residents of South Carolina and members of the South Carolina Writers Association. This morning, we're going to have presentations from the two authors about their work, about literacy, about writing, and that's what we're here for. We're celebrating literacy. Palmetto Literacy Council is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded by Dr. Dodie Hodges in 2019. And this organization provides free tutoring in basic reading, writing, and math to students of all ages throughout Horry County. And this is a fundraiser for our organization, so we welcome donations. I think there's several ways you can do that. I'm gonna let Dr. Hodges possibly weigh in on that later, but without further ado, I'm going to turn the panel over to Barbara first, and Rebecca will join her, and they will have a conversation with one another, and we will make some time after that for questions from our viewers. So off to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Dodie. Thank you both for allowing us to participate in this with you, because reading has been such a huge part of my life from as far back as I can remember. And before I could read, I was even creating stories and dictating them to people. So being able to read, I don't know what my life would have been like if I couldn't read. And of course, as you get older, you discover how much math is important too. So it's very important, the things that y'all are teaching people. And I'm glad that you have this organization that we're able to participate in it. What I thought I would do first is I'm going to read a short passage from The Watchers of Manaya. This is book one of an epic fantasy trilogy. And in this scene, what you need to know is my main character, my protagonist, is Adana. And due to a prophecy, her mother had known of her death, her own death, her mother's death, and knew that there was trouble coming for her daughter, who was not yet of age to reign. So Adana is about 15 in this particular scene, and she has been sent for her protection to the neighboring kingdom of Elwar. Now, what you need to know is she's a watcher, which means she's a woman warrior. She's used to an environment that, for one thing, she wears a tunic and leggings and carries weapons. And Elwar is a more formal kind of world. And so it's a very different world. She has to wear different kinds of clothes. There's different kinds of etiquette and so forth. And she's literally a fish out of water in this case. Not only that, I don't remember this scene has it, but just in case it does, she has a telepathic connection with a giraffe. All of the royal family in Manaya have a telepathic bond with a giraffe. And so the giraffe was left in Manaya, and she is in Elwar, which actually makes the connection a little bit uncomfortable. In fact, a lot uncomfortable. So this is one of the first days she's in Elwar, and I'll just read this little section. And the reason I chose this is because sometimes when you feel like you don't know something, whether it's you can't read, or your reading is poor, or you don't speak the language, or you just don't feel like it's the world you're accustomed to, or you're outranked by the people around you because of what they know versus what you know. And so this is a scene early into her time in Elwar. Swaths of cloth enveloped Adana's legs as she stumbled along the twisting corridor of the castle. She kicked at the material, unable to feel her legs under all of it. How do they manage? Did you say something, miss? A startled maid stood, mop in hand. Eyes widening in recognition, she dropped to a quick curtsy. My apologies, Your Highness. I didn't recognize you without your uniform. Me neither, Adana said, unable to escape the snarl in her voice. She kicked at the layers of petticoats and finally reached down and grabbed as many hems as she could and pulled them up. The maid blanched at the sight and turned away. Blazes, Adana said, and dropped the skirt again. And when it due to ruin propriety on her first days in Elwar, She rushed down the passage, kicking her anger out on the thick underskirts each time the material ensnared her legs. After 3 wrong turns, Adana stood before the door to Queen Quilla's torture chamber, known as the small dining room. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Kiffin turned toward her, his eyes a mixture of concern and regret. Lyra's blonde head popped up, a look of vicious glee on her face. She slanted her gaze at her mother, whose back straightened, if it was possible to be any straighter. A frown of displeasure darkened the queen's face. Breathe. Adana entered the room, each foot placed with careful precision. I apologize for my tardiness, Queen Quilla. The hall's still... The skirts swilled in odd directions, catching her off balance. She stumbled and caught herself on the back of the chair closest to her. Kiffin half rose from his seat before Quilla stopped him with a look. Crimson bloomed in splotches along his cheeks, and he returned to his seat, head bowed. Adana watched a muscle flex in his jaw. Clumsy savage, Quilla said, a sneer stretching across her features. She laid down her fork and studied Adana. I guess it's no wonder. I've heard the horrid details of your uncivilized kingdom. The chair took the pressure Adana squeezed into the wood without complaint. She pushed and shoved the skirts, lifting them just enough to slide around the legs of the supportive chair and settle in its seat. Quilla raised an eyebrow. You plan to break your fast way down there? Several seats separated her from Kiffin and Lyra. It seemed best. Adana picked up the napkin and spread it in her lap with as much decorum as possible. Again, Quilla, I apologize for my tardiness. I'm still learning the twists and turns of your palace. She shrugged, unwilling to show how much the queen's taunts angered her. It's just so different from home. I can help you, Kiffin said, a slight lift to his voice. The crimson seeped higher in his face, but he held her gaze with a friendly smile. Thank you, Adana nodded and accepted a cup of tea from a servant. The poor woman had waited at first, her face showing confusion on whether to serve Adana at the foot of the table or wait for her to move. So as you can see, she is struggling to fit in very much there. And I am not the person who didn't learn how to read. I learned how to read and ate up books. But I've been in places where I didn't know something and other people around me did. And I feel like that scene captures that quite a bit. And in the book, there are people who help her. Believe it or not, Lyra ends up being one of her best helps, which is the young princess who is viciously watching what's happening with glee. She ends up deciding it's more fun to upset mom by helping Adana. So help comes from unusual places, no matter where we are when we feel out of place. So, but I'm going to let Rebecca do her little thing, her little intro and read, and then we can talk about things. How about that? Does that sound good, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's great. Great. And thank you for reading that part of your story. That's a great starting place. And I share Barbara's appreciation for Dodie and Patricia and the work of the council. Literacy, it's interesting when Barbara and I talked last week, we recognized just how critical literacy is in both of our stories, but that's because it's critical in the context of the larger world and pretty much everyone's lives. So, so my story is very different from her. My book is quite different from hers. I wrote a historical fiction piece. It's called Trouble the Water, and it's about South Carolinian Robert Smalls. And I think everyone logged on is South Carolinian and probably knows the story, or at least knows that there is a story about Robert Smalls. Smalls was born in Beaufort, 1839. He was born enslaved and had an extraordinary life. One of the many things that he did, he liberated himself and his family in a do or die escape. He served in both state legislature and U.S. Congress, but he was a champion of literacy. And not everyone knows that part of his story. As an enslaved person, when he was young, he was not allowed to learn to read or write. It was against the law for anyone to teach an enslaved person to read or to write. And so that was not part of his life. But he was growing up alongside the daughter of the family that owned him and his mother and others. There were just a month apart, very same age, and he watched her go to school. And I think early on he was aware that uh, his personal agency, his access to information, which is power, and really his own empowerment was tied up in literacy, and in his case, in his inability to access literacy. So we know that later in his life, he did learn to read and to write, and there are a variety of stories and fables and speculations about how that happened. We know that after he secured his own freedom, he hired a tutor and studied with a tutor nearly every day of his adult life. It was that important to him. What an awful lot of people don't know is that one of the very first things he did when he was in Congress, in the legislature, was to author some of the very first legislation that ensured literacy for all the children of South Carolina, gave access to education, and it was the first of its kind in the whole country. So he was quite a trailblazer when it comes to literacy, truly a hero and a champion, and it's a story that a lot of people are not aware of. I'm not going to read a section from the book right now, but I mean, maybe we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But what I do want to share is the part of my journey in writing the story, and I want Barbara to share some of her journey as well, because the love of reading and the love of stories, I think, is common to many of us who write. But what I discovered in this story, well, let me give you a little backstory. So I'm not a native South Carolinian. I moved here from Texas, and I moved because of Robert Smalls. I had heard his story on a carriage tour about 8 years ago. We were living in Dallas, Texas. We were here for a very brief visit. I got on a carriage tour. I heard a little bit of the man's story, and it absolutely blew me away that he had such a historic and impactful life, that he made a difference in so many people's lives, and that I'd never heard the name. And that kind of got under my skin. And for the next several years, I was reading about him and trying to learn a little bit more. And that curiosity turned into obsession, I guess. And about 4 years ago, we moved here so that I could really research his story and try to make it accessible to more people. So that's how the book happened. But one of the interesting things that happened, and I think this happens when we read and when we write and we share stories with other people, his story taught me a lot. It taught me about the power of literacy. His own ability to do the things that he did in his adult life were tied directly, of course, to his ability to read and to write and to communicate and to persuade and to legislate and he was a real bridge builder in so many ways. And that was all tied to that skill that so many of us take for granted, the ability to read, to write, to learn, to communicate. One of the other things he taught me, and I guess we all know a little of this, but maybe it's kind of in the background of our minds, and he really brought it to the forefront for me. And that is that, well, a couple of things. The most important of which maybe is that until we are kind of collectively committed to literacy for everyone, to access to education for everyone, there will always be persons who have a great deal to offer who may not get to bring that to us. You know, I can't even imagine really what South Carolina would be like now had Robert Smalls not pursued his interest in reading and writing and his gifts in leadership. We'd be a very different place. And in some ways, the country could be a very different place. And yet, that disenfranchisement occurred then and occurs still for so many reasons. And so again, it makes me very, very appreciative of groups like the Palmetto Literacy Council and others that that are really committed to access to literacy.
And
So I'm going to pause there and let Barbara jump in because we both have so much to say about
I know
that.
I wanted to tag in on that because one of the things people might not know about me, professionally, I'm a corporate trainer. My first corporate training position actually wasn't corporate; it was nonprofit, and I worked for the local Urban League, and I ran a welfare to work training program. It was a 12-week program, and we called it computer and office skills, but it was so much more than that. I taught them professionalism skills and how to, how to dress properly, help them learn how to communicate in a more effective way and so forth. And to come into that program, because the goal of the program was for the people to come out and get a job, which we did have a 96% job placement rate. So we were doing well. But to get into that program, you needed to have a GED or a high school diploma. And we were funded through Department of Social Services. So it had to be people who were actually on welfare. And I forget I don't remember what it's called now. It had a different name back then. So, but everybody knows the term welfare. So we'll just go with that. But they were funding it. So it had to be people that were in these programs. And so we would interview them, and we would also give them a math and an English test. And I was telling Rebecca the other day, my cutoff was 8th grade for math and 7th grade for English. And I can't tell you how many people who had high school diplomas or GEDs could not score that high on those tests. Now, this was in the 90s, the 1990s that this was going on. So, close to 30 years ago, but I'm not so sure it's that much different these days, to be honest with you, but I remember being so shocked. And occasionally I would get someone who would score what was called a 12.9 on the test, and 12.9 meant they were scoring the best they could score. They basically had a perfect score because it was 12th grade, 9 months. And when I would get those people, I would get so excited because it's like, wow, this person actually had people who helped them learn. And there were people I had to turn away, and it broke my heart, but we had to have some kind of guidance as to where, what we could work with. And so I guarantee you, it's like Rebecca said, there are people who maybe have something to contribute and aren't able to do it because they don't have those writing skills, they don't have those math skills or the reading skills or so forth. And it's a shame. It's an absolute shame that that's the case. And those of us who do have them, we're really, really blessed. And I don't think we realize how blessed we are. That, working at the Urban League and working with the students that I had woke me up to a lot of stuff. Now, there were things in my background that was very similar to theirs because I was divorced and was raising kids and had some rough roads in my past. So I had some commonality with them, but I had the advantage of education that a lot of them did not have. I had the advantage of family that a lot of them did not have. So helping people anywhere when they have all these barriers put in their way, any kind of way you can break down that barrier. And there are students, I had a contact from a student of mine, and I'll tell you, I taught a lot of people, and her name did not even ring a bell, but she found me on LinkedIn about 6 or 7 years ago. And she's in New York now, and she is a corporate trainer. And she went through my training program. And she said, I have been looking for you everywhere. I wanted to find you and tell you what I'm doing. And, I hear from her periodically on LinkedIn, and it's just amazing. And, I occasionally run across a few of them, and several of them are doing well. Others probably, I don't know. It's one of the things we found, it was hard to track once they left the program. It was very hard to track what happened to them unless they kept the doors open. But I know a lot of them did really well. And it was kind of great to be part of something that could give them that opportunity, that step up, that ability to move from that welfare role into something different. And in a lot of cases, it was environment that prevented them from having that education, that literacy. And it really broke my heart to see it. Um, I told Rebecca, I am raising 2 of my grandchildren right now, and they are biracial, and their mother is caught up in stuff, best way to put it. And I know if they weren't with me, they would not be where they are. They're straight A students. My grandson is in the 4th grade. He loves to read. In fact, we're entering some of his pieces in Imerys. If y'all have never heard of Imerys, it's a writing group here in South Carolina. I think they're based here in Greenville. But they're doing a 3rd through 12th grade writing contest. The deadline's tomorrow. So if you're interested, it's emrys.org, EMRYS.org. But I'm entering some of his stuff in their contest because it's amazing what he's coming up with. And I'm not so sure, he was 4 when he came to live with me. I'm not so sure he'd be there if I wasn't raising him. So it's kind of very personal to me in a lot of different ways. But
Well, and Barbara, I think you bring up a couple of really important points. And one, of course, is that opportunity is a game changer.
it is.
And, and so frequently persons are in, in a context or a situation, or maybe even a kind of a generational context of illiteracy. But what we know is that is so changeable, and remarkably so.
Mm-hmm.
When I was living in Dallas, I don't know if the folks that are online with us know my background. So really briefly, it's education and theology. And I worked in a lot of big church. Dallas has these giant churches.
Yeah.
And I was on staff on a couple of those. But one of our churches, like many community organizations do, we adopted a school in the Dallas area. And it was in the zip code that part of the state was using to forecast future prison capacity needs. So what the state was doing was they were looking at the zip code, they were examining 3rd grade reading scores, and then they would extrapolate out to forecast capacity needs in the future, which is just a heartbreaking concept to begin with. And so our church adopted a grade school there, and we were working specifically with 2nd and 3rd grade teachers and their students. And it was, it wasn't rocket science. It was very simple. We had volunteers that went and read with kids and helped out in the classroom and listened to kids while they read, and celebrated, and watched the light bulbs go off when anyone learns a new skill. It's so life-giving. It's just magic. And to see a child discover that they really are capable and really can read and really can communicate and really can tell a story and all those things, it changes, or maybe not changes, it completes their understanding of who they can be and their capacity and their possibilities. And after just 2 or 3 years, those 3rd grade reading scores had gone from way below grade level to grade level, and it wasn't complicated, and it wasn't challenge. It was a lot of fun for the people that were involved with it. We all learned a lot from the kids and their families. The kids and their families learned a lot. These great relationships were built, but it was a game changer,
Right.
And not just short term. And so I think one of the things that's really important for us to remember when we sit down with our kids or grandkids to read a story, or when we participate in a community organization that's encouraging tutoring in a school or supporting a literacy program like this, those small things have extraordinary payoffs. and they're societal payoffs. They're big, and they are they really change the fabric of a community, and they're enormous.
Right.
And sometimes we forget. Sometimes I think we're overwhelmed by large societal problems, and we shake our heads and we wonder what's wrong and what's going on in schools or whatever. And the reality is that really good things are going on, and really good things are going on um, in individual homes and in small organizations that make incredible differences in the lives of real kids who grow up to be real contributors, and it's good for all of us.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Rebecca and I talked a couple of weeks ago, and when she told me that, I was like, Rebecca, my church actually does that here in Greenville. Now I go to a church that's actually in Malden, and we're across the street from a middle school and an elementary school, and we are involved in those churches, those schools, on a regular basis. COVID has made that a little harder because we had mentors going in. We had all sorts of different things we were doing. We were sponsoring things for them, but they still reach out to us. I mean, we started working with them and reaching out and involving ourselves in their reading programs. They have, in September, they have their reading day, and it's a night where the families come together and there's things about books and learning and everything. And my minister is part of their school improvement council. And he told us, he said, I sat on that school improvement council for 9 months and basically listened. And then they got ready to do this reading day, and they looked at him and they said, Matt, what about your church? Would that you like to do anything? He says, absolutely. And they said, well, how big a table do you want? He said, we want the gym. And we literally set up this huge thing where when they came into the gym, we had this line, like a tunnel of people with pom-poms. And the person at the front of the line got the name of the kid. And all the way down that line, as they ran through, people were cheering their name. Hooray, Billy, hooray, whatever their name was. And so the smiles and everything. And we gave them books. And right now, we're collecting money to put books in those vending machines. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a lot of schools have book vending machines, and kids earn a token by meeting their reading goals, and they get a book they get to keep out of that vending machine. So we're in the process of helping the elementary school get their vending machines. We collected, of all things, Jolly Ranchers. They give away Jolly Ranchers in the middle school for achieving their reading goals. So, we did a drive, and boom, I have no idea how many Jolly Ranchers we got, but it was a lot. And so we've been doing things with that school all along. And when when a crisis occurs, we had a family, their apartment burned, 6 children and a single mom. And our church took those children shopping for clothes, bought things, donated things. So they had things like vacuum cleaners, dishes, you name it, and those are game changers, because if you're already at a disadvantage and you lose your home, things like books are not on the priorities list at that point, which, they're always on my priority list.
I can imagine, right?
But, so anywhere where you are, you can do these kinds of things. Even if you're not part of a church, there are schools that can still use you, even during COVID. They'll use you differently, but they can still use you. And most schools are dying, they're begging for mentors and people who will help children who the schools are recognizing if they just had a hand, if they just had somebody to reach out a hand and give them a little extra, then these kids could go somewhere. So I think it's really cool that we both have kind of been involved in something like that.
Right. I think there are so many, many ways that can happen. You were describing the gym full of celebrating kids. There's another little school that another church in Dallas supported, and they did this thing that was so simple and so brilliant. But I guess schools still all have these, what they call the cafetorium, you know, it's like the, it's the cafeteria, it's the auditorium, it's the assembly room, it's all that. But they took, it was an elementary school, but they hung the banners of a zillion colleges around the perimeter of that, on, you know, across the ceiling, in a school where college aspiration was not necessarily a given for every child. But that changed because every day they saw those banners and they saw those names and they began asking their teachers, and teachers would talk about, you know, the school they went to or the football team or whatever.
Right.
And it changes the individuals and the families kind of vision. It moves the horizon in
Right.
a way that is really remarkable. One of the things you mentioned, though, that I wanted to make sure we talked about today is what COVID has done in terms of access for education. And I think a lot of literacy groups and schools and other organizations are really trying to sort out how to address this.
Mhm.
And that is that, you know, for a long time, and still, there are uh, counties or zip codes or various areas that are chronically underserved in terms of resources, in terms of and you know, having enough books on hand, things like that. But
Or because
COVID,
of a natural disaster in those same areas.
right, same kinds of things. And but I think COVID has really accentuated some of those discrepancies.
Mhm.
And we're all, and we certainly see it in South Carolina, but in other parts of the country, that there are students in a lot of places that don't have the supportive grandmother at home,
Right.
or a home with Wi-Fi access,
Mhm.
or maybe there's Wi-Fi access, but there are not enough computers or tablets for the kids to sit in on their classroom work. You know, we know that there are kids, you know, they're trying to get close enough to the local McDonald's to catch a signal
Mhm.
to do their work. And that's still that's a critical issue in terms of
Right.
that kind of access, and particularly so right now. And I'm not sure that we see a lot of solutions for that, but I know that there are folks working on that. And I think it's up to all of us to do our part to explore ways that we can be part of changing that.
Right. I think one of the things COVID has done along those lines is, you know, before COVID, you heard murmurs of Wi-Fi should be available to all.
Right.
It was out there. It was out there. And, you know, people are like, yeah, right. How are you going to do that?
That seemed like a
But
luxury kind of, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
But now it's a necessity.
Right.
And not just for kids, it's a necessity for adults and for them to continue to work. And you were talking about the ones who are trying to get close enough to McDonald's or Starbucks or somewhere where there's a Wi-Fi.
Right.
Well, somebody's got to take them there.
Right.
And if mom and dad are working and maybe working in a manufacturing job where guess what? They're at work.
Right.
These kids are really struggling. And I know schools have done what they could. I know they also struggle with supply because I know with Greenville County, I did some customer service training for all the front office personnel and a lot of the district office people over the last year and a half. And one of the things I heard about was the fact that not all of the computers came back at the end of the school year.
Yeah.
So you've got the resources, plus you've got the resources that did come back, but they're not so great anymore.
Right.
And you know, all of a sudden we went from, you know, you got to middle school and you got a computer or Chromebook to everybody got a Chromebook.
Right.
And it's a challenge, definitely a challenge. And I don't want to discount Palmetto literacy, but I do want to mention, and I can't recall the name, but I saw something on the news the other day about some young girl, young lady who recognized this, and she's actually collecting people's castaway computers and they're refurbishing them and sending them out to the schools. And she started this not in the South, but it's spread over the country. And I wish I could remember who it was, but I forgot about it till you were talking about this. And I was like, you know, I have a couple of computers laying around, you know, and what what good are they doing me when they could be doing somebody else a great deal of service? So, and all this adds up, because if you don't have this, I'm really wondering what this generation's marks are going to be. You know, they talk about the boomers and the Generation X and the millennials and the Ys, and Generation Z is, you can't tell me this is not going to impact who they are and how they are in the workforce and how they interact with each other. And it would be a shame if, because of COVID, that the illiteracy rates go up.
Right. And at the same time, I think this is an opportunity for not only young learners, but all of us, there's some real possibility for some resiliency, strength that comes out of this, because we are seeing what happens when people, identify an issue and kind of get really creative and look for a new way. I go back to Robert Smalls and some of the things I learned from his story. He was able to see a future for himself that was almost impossible to see. He was looking at a future that did not exist for himself and for his family and for his community. And we know from history, from our own reading, that when people can see that impossible future, it becomes a possible future.
Right.
And I think there are real opportunities for us to help students, to help families, and to learn from them in ways that help us to become more creative, more resilient, and more connected, more collaborative. That's, I think if we've learned anything in this last year, it's that, we might be, I hate the term socially distanced. We're not socially, we're physically distanced.
Right.
But we're being, if we're thoughtful about it and intentional about it and determined about it, we can be socially very connected and far more capable and far more resilient and far more productive.
Right.
If we choose that, and it's a matter of if we really determine that collaboration rather than competition is the way forward.
Exactly.
I
saw a
think
note from Patricia. I think she wants to ask us some questions.
Oh, good.
So Patricia, hey.
Hi, thanks.
There she is.
Thank you so much for your passion about literacy. I mean, that's great. I think Dodie wants to speak a little bit later about what we're specifically doing, but I mean, that really dovetails with what we're trying to do in the Horry County area. But we do have some people who are really interested. A lot of our people who are watching are writers as well. And I think we could start with, you guys can decide. You're getting along so well. This is
I'm so glad we got to meet each other this way.
Yeah,
I know, isn't it great? I read both of your books, and of course they're so different. And I think, in terms of genre, Barbara, you're, as you said, you're in the fantasy area, and I'm assuming your books are primarily maybe for young adults. But you could talk a little bit about maybe what got you into wanting to write in that genre, especially with your background,
right.
And about maybe some of the your writing process, how you get your ideas, and how you maybe share those ideas. I'm going to hit you up with one more thing, and your inspirations. What authors you really got inspired by, or what types of works. And I'm going to Rebecca, that's to you too. But as far as Rebecca specifically, I would ask you to maybe talk about the research that was involved. And for me, it's fascinating to know how, when you do historical fiction, you really take creative license, because obviously you didn't interview Robert Smalls, and I don't, later in his life, I'm sure he did, writing about his own life or what he was doing. But I just thought it's amazing to be able to build that world, but not say things that are, inaccurate. You really have to probably adhere. So I'm going to shut up now and let you guys take over from there.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'll go first. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so one of the things I want to mention is she said, you know, you created a world. Well, in fantasy, I create the entire world. So that's kind of interesting. And I'm trying to remember all the questions Patricia asked. One thing I want to point out is a lot of people just assume this is a YA book. It's technically being released as an adult epic fiction. I mean, epic fantasy, but a lot of epic fantasy does cross over to YA. A lot of that's probably because of the age of my protagonist. She's 15 at the beginning of the book. She's 18 by the end of book 1. But a lot of adults are reading this book too. And we see that a lot in YA these days. And when we get to book 3, definitely people have asked me about, what about middle grade? Like my grandson, he's 9.5. And he's like, I want to read your book. I want to read your book when it comes out, because he's my reader. And so I sat down with him. I was like, I think it's going to be a little old for him. And it was. He insisted, and we sat down and read the prologue in the first chapter. And I said, do you want to go on? He goes, no, I think that's enough for now. So that told me, and he hasn't asked me to read it again. So that tells me what I figured, because there's some big words in here. Plus, it's a 96,000 word book, which typically is not the YA genre. The voice is not exactly YA, it's more of an adult voice, but a lot of YA has that adult voice these days too. So I don't have a problem being called YA, but it's definitely appealing to people who are reading adult fiction too. As far as, I'm trying to remember the question she asked, how I got started. I think I mentioned earlier, I was dictating stories when I was not old enough to know how to read or write. And back when I was a kid at 4, you still hadn't learned your letters or your alphabet, because we didn't have the school systems we have now. I didn't learn how to read until the 1st grade, but boy, the minute I knew how to read, you know, the world opened up for me. And I don't remember a time when I wasn't writing stories, to be honest with you. I've always created stories. There's always something going on up in Barbara's head. And my ideas, it's cliche, the Watchers of Manaya came from a dream. It's cliche, I know, but that's where it came from. But just the root of it. The rest of it came from the characters, to be honest with you. Once I started writing, the characters told me what they wanted me to do. And there are things they do in these books that I'm like, I didn't see that coming. And then there, you know, I knew kind of where we were going. I knew what I knew the beginning was. I knew what the conflict was going to be. And I knew ultimately, I thought, what the end was going to be. But these are very different from what my beginning ideas were, because the characters to some degree take over. People ask about whether you're a pantser or a plotter. And for those of you who don't know the difference, pantsers basically write by the seat of their pants. Plotters, you know, they have the spreadsheet, they have the outline, they have it all figured out. They've mapped out the scenes and everything. I would imagine maybe for historical fiction, you might have had to do that. I'm curious to hear about your answer to this, Rebecca. But I was a pantser for books 1 and 2. But this is epic. So epic means you've got all these different story threads. And by the end of book 3, they all had to be complete. So I made a bare bones outline for book 3, or else, I mean, book 3 is 116,000 words. It comes out March 1st. If I had not made that bare bones outline, who knows where this thing would have gone. And even then, the characters were still surprising me. And I really thought book 3 was going to be right at about 100,000 words. And I was thinking, yeah, we're getting really close and we're not ready to be done yet. So my process is a lot of times driven by where my muse, which are my characters in a lot of cases, take place. I know Patricia asked you about research, Rebecca. Even though I create the world, I had to do research too.
Sure. There
There are giraffes in my books. In fact, I don't have a physical copy of book 2. It's out now, but you'll notice the cover of book 2. That's a Donna, and she's on the back of a giraffe. That only happens once. People have actually ridden giraffes. It's not a very comfortable process. It only happens once as she's escaping something, but it's a really grab you kind of cover, and I love that cover. But as far as research, unknowingly, I was doing research for this story in high school all my life. I became enamored with giraffes when I was in high school. And there's not a lot written on giraffes, to be honest with you, but I found pretty much what was out there. There's battles. Well, I read The Art of War. I have a book called Medieval Combat. There's a scene in the first book where they're hunting a boar, and I actually spent a few hours on YouTube one day trying to figure out how to describe the sounds of the boar when they hunt him and when they kill him. What's it going to sound like? And believe it or not, you can find that on YouTube. So you still have to do research. The world in fantasy is, in this particular fantasy world, it's very much like Africa. It's not our world, but I patterned it after Africa. So I looked up and saw, to see what kinds of foods were there, what kinds of fruits grew, what kinds of vegetables grew there. There were a lot of things I pulled from it. So I did do research, and it's just a different kind of research. I would much rather write epic fantasy than historical fiction, because I can do what I want with it once I know what the barriers are to the reality of research. My writing life, I told you, pretty much pantser or plotter. I write a couple of things. I'm raising 2 grandchildren, and so my writing is, I can't do like I used to do before they were with me. Before they were with me, I was able to write much longer stretches of time. There's kids who need to get up and go to school. There's kids who need to get their homework done, especially with COVID now. They were here when we're in the hybrid program, so they're in the schools now, but they were here, and I was trying to step away and do that. I have a job that I'm doing, so I squeeze writing in where I can. Prior to grandchildren, I had specific days that were writing days and specific days that were corporate training days. I'm self-employed, so I could do that. I don't write at night or first thing in the morning. And I know a lot of writers will say, if you're looking for time to write, just get up early and do it then. Well, 2 things. I have fibromyalgia, so usually my most productive sleep is those last few hours in the morning. And my grandson, I don't know how he knows, but I wake up and I do stretches in the bed before I get up, because it just helps with my muscular issues. And he always shows up. I cannot get up and do anything without him being up. So I've got to find other times to write. And so I make sure I work it into my schedule, and I do a to-do list, and I put it on my to-do list, and I make sure it's in there. As far as books published, I think you asked about that. I'm looking at the list of questions you sent me before, so I'm kind of going from there. I had a lot of short stories and essays published, a lot of them through the Pedigree Review, which is SCWA. I've had books in something called A Story in Stupefying Stories, which was an online science fiction fantasy journal. Also Moonshine Review, which a lot of people from South Carolina submit to Moonshine Review. It's based out of Charlotte. And, a little bit here and there, but these novels, this is what I've been working towards for quite a while. And I'll tell you, it's not an overnight story. It was not an overnight story. And I finished writing the first book in 2008. It got published last December. So book 2 got published this past Monday, and book 3 is March 1st. And that's unusual too. And let me just tell you, because don't assume, well, if Barbara did that, why can't all these other authors do this? Books 1 and 2 were written when I signed with my publisher. And he said, I'm not publishing the first book till book 3 is written. Well, I had to get it written. So that's why we're able to go boom, 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 boom. And he wanted to do it that way because with a small publisher, when you've got a series, a lot of people wait till the series is over, and then they'll buy the books because they don't want to read the book and go, oh, now I'm waiting. And I have people who read book 1 and they only had to wait another week for book 2, and they're like, it's killing me. So the struggle's real there. But as far as authors who's influenced my writing, first of all, fantasy was not what I read growing up. And that's unusual for most fantasy writers. Most fantasy writers grew up reading, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the Dragon Riders of Pern and things like that. Now I've read those books, but I actually didn't get into reading fantasy until I was in my 30s. And I tended to read more contemporary fiction and more women's fiction and mystery prior to that. Historical fiction, I love historical fiction, and I still read eclectically. I read a lot of stuff. I even toss in a romance here and there. There's a lot of different things I will read, and I love all of them. But when I got to fantasy, it spoke to my imagination. And that's why I started writing fantasy. And to be honest with you, sure, I've got short stories that are not fantasy, but they are, they're contemporary fiction, but they're based on some things from my background. I saw a question say, so what made that switch happen? I can't really I do remember my brother is a science fiction reader, and he has written several science fiction books. His name is Henry Vogel. They're published. And I remember saying something to him around the time I switched, saying, okay, I'm curious, but I don't want something that's far-fetched. What would you suggest? So he gave me the St. Camber series by Catherine, I think it's Catherine Kerr. And I was like, that's pretty good. And I still, I read those and then went back to what I was reading. And then the next time Christmas rolled around, he gave me something else. He gave me, and anybody who reads fantasy, it will be familiar with Robert Jordan and The Wheel of Time. And a lot of my imagination took off with that one. And there's actually a character in The Watchers of Manaya whose beginning seeds were from a character that's in The Wheel of Time. She's not the same character, but her seeds are there. So it influenced me quite a bit. Have I read George R.R. Martin? I've read part of them, not all of them. I enjoyed the ones I read. I didn't feel the impulse to read the others, but I read a lot of different people. I also read urban fantasy a lot now today. Faith Hunter is one of my favorite writers. David B. Coe, D.B. Jackson. But back in my youth, there were people who just wrote the classics. The Secret Garden to this day is right here in my heart, So I hope that answers the question. I want to stop because I want to give Rebecca time to speak, but I hope I answered the questions. If I didn't, after Rebecca's done, I'll be glad to answer something else, but maybe that'll give you some ideas.
You did. Thank you so much, Barbara. You hit all the high points.
Okay, good.
No, that's terrific. That's great. I think it gives writers a really good idea about how the world of the professional author. Okay, Rebecca?
Well, so some things that are in common for sure. I, like Barbara, I loved reading and making stories when I was, from childhood. I have this great memory. I grew up in the panhandle of Texas, where we would get these crazy blizzards now and then, and we'd have a snow day. And on snow days, we got to stay home, and my mom would set up a card table, and my sister and I would draw pictures and write stories and staple them together. That I remember that as a really special time. And I always loved reading and writing. When I went to college, though, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I mean, absolutely no clue. Or I didn't think I did. And so when I did my undergrad work, I was in a program that encouraged, like so many of us, encouraged efficiency. And so I took my English and creative writing and literature placement test, and I placed out of all that. And so I never took another English class or literature or anything, and kind of focused on sciences and education a little bit. And then when I went to grad school, it was seminary, and I did get to read and write again, and it sort of rekindled that. But I didn't think very hard about pursuing writing as a vocation or even avocation until I came across the story of Smalls. I mean, the story sort of found me and got into me. And it's, I tell people it is almost like, like I was I was sort of tapped on the shoulder to be one of the voices to tell this story. And I hope there are a lot of voices that tell his story, but that's kind of how it came about. But it really kindled for me the love of writing, creative writing, and creating a story. My process for the story was very different from Barbara's, and oh my gosh, I just applaud someone who can create an entire world and the story arc. With historical fiction, we're kind of handed the skeleton of the story. I knew enough about Small Story to know when it began, when he was born, and some of the things that preceded that, and some of the things that happened throughout his life and the conclusion of his life. So I had a very basic skeleton. And there's some very good biographies. And I determined fairly early on that I didn't really want to write a biography. I love great biographies. But what intrigued me so much in this story were the things that don't show up in the historical narrative, the things that aren't in the record. And the more I read about him early on, the more curious I got about the things that I couldn't find answers for. We don't know who his father was. We don't know where he even got his last name. His mother's last name was Polite. The owner's last name was McKee. He's Smalls. We don't know how he met. He was married twice. We don't know how he met either of those women. We don't know very much about how he learned to read early on. We know a little bit about what happened later in his life. And there are lots of, well, when you go on a tour here in Beaufort, you get a lot of different variations of a lot of different speculative stories. But there's just a lot that we don't know. And my own background in education and theology, it just makes me perpetually curious about people's relationships and their motivations and their longings and their heartaches and all those things that don't show up in a biography. And that's what I wanted to explore. I really wanted to know what it was like, not only for Smalls to grow up, becoming of age at the time that the Civil War started, what that was, what it was like to, I can just barely imagine. I had to use a lot of imagination to consider being enslaved when you're capable, that you have your own life to live, and someone else is telling you how to do that. I raised two sons, and I know what it's like when they were told what to do instead of being given agency in their own decisions when they were young men. I think we all know a little bit about love and loss and betrayal and heartache and dreams and all of those things. And so I wanted to explore those things, but I also wanted to do it in a way that really honored the historical record and stayed true to that. So of course I read everything I could get my hands on. I was very curious about the role of religious communities, because religious communities played, they had an enormous voice in the lead up to the Civil War and during the war. We had, we had the pro-slavery arm of Christianity, which I'm a United Methodist, and that's hard for me to imagine, but that was the case. We had the abolitionist groups, including Christian abolitionists, and we had those that were kind of silent, and I wanted to explore that. I wanted to understand the role of the geography. So I mentioned that I grew up in West Texas, where we don't have water and tides and harbors and boats and all those things. And so part of my research, and it was just essential to be in the Low Country and to walk the streets of Beaufort and to walk the streets of Charleston and to learn about the water and the trees, the landscape, it's like in stories like this, and I think in Barbara's too, the geography, the physical context is sort of a character, and we want to get that right. So I researched a lot of that. I spent a ton of time in our library. Thank God for librarians and patient librarians. I had some time with a wonderful historian who gave me some great feedback. And I had the extraordinary good fortune of meeting Robert Small's great grandson, who lives in Charleston and was generous with time and input. I had decided early on that I didn't want to interview the family members specifically. I felt like their stories belong to them. Um, and those are theirs, and they are theirs to share if they're not part of the historical record and public domain. But it was wonderful to hear his input and to hear what mattered to him. And my greatest concern really was to tell the story in a way that honored Small's character, that honored the spirit of his life and his legacy, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to have that conversation with great grandson. His name is Michael Moore. He lives in Charleston and has been absolutely influential in the building of the new International African American Museum there. So my research was completely new territory for me. Just the prospect of writing a book was, when I decided finally that it was time to let go of my job for what I thought was just going to be a little while and research and write the book. I didn't know what I was doing, and I literally Googled how to write a book, which I don't recommend, but it worked out okay. You can get a lot of great information online. There are wonderful workshops and classes and tutorials and groups that are very helpful. Same thing in libraries, same thing in local, community literary groups. I could not be more fortunate than living in Beaufort, South Carolina, where the Pat Conroy Literary Center is just central to my experience here. I had opportunity for some great workshops and some wonderful relationships that really helped along the way. So I guess what I would say to those who are writing or watching us who are considering writing, if there's a story in you, it wants to be born. it wants to have life, and you can do that, and there are a lot of pathways to that. There are a lot of opportunities. So things like the South Carolina Writers Association, things like literacy groups, things like the Conroy Center, there are lots and lots of opportunities for those who want to explore writing fiction or nonfiction or memoir or history, whatever it is. I hope that those who are writing and considering writing will really just dive into it. Give it your heart, and it'll take you there.
And I'll just add one little thing to that is, I don't know how many people tell me I'm going to write a book someday. And my answer to them is, then start.
Right.
Because if you don't start, you're never going to write that book.
Right.
And even if it's just 100 words a day, start. Do something.
Absolutely.
And Barbara talked about kind of finding the time, where if you do it in the morning or in the evening or 100 words a day or whatever. For some of us, one of the things that was helpful to me, I looked in the mirror one day and thought, okay, so I'm this age and I would like to see this book published before I'm, before I miss it. And I just did the math, I thought, okay, so let's call it a 90,000 word book. If I want to have a draft inside of a year, I need to be writing a couple of thousand words a day. Mm-hmm. And just having just sort of basic metrics like that can be really, really helpful. And I think particularly for beginning writers, because I think it's, I think there's sort of this myth that like the inspiration will just show up, and
it is a myth. That's definitely.
Yeah, and the light will like beam in through the window and we'll have this flash of inspiration and we'll sit down and write for 9 hours and we'll be done. And mostly it's like, you sit down and you're determined that you're going to outline a scene, or you're going to write a conversation, or you're going to to finish this idea in this chapter before you work on the next one. And for me, there were a lot of days where I just said, I will write 2,000 words, and they might be 2,000 pretty poorly crafted words, but you can edit. You can
Right.
edit what's there. You can't edit something that's not
Absolutely.
in
That's
existence.
true. You have-
And I think editing's a lot of fun. So just write like crazy, and let it be messy and
Yep.
incoherent and disconnected, because the connections will find themselves. And like Barbara said, the characters, oh my gosh, I fell in love with characters that weren't historical,
Right. No, I would yeah, absolutely.
I fell in love with my fictional characters, and they will tell you where the story goes. And then it's fun. And
I
then you
love that idea. I love that idea. I don't write fiction, but I've heard from a lot of fiction authors that they take their cues from the characters, which I think is absolutely amazing. I mean, that seems to be something that fiction authors, or in your case, from the fictional characters. We did have a question for you, Rebecca, specifically. One of our viewers wanted to know what you're currently working on, especially since you spent so much focus on this and this was your first writing effort. So what's next?
Right. Well, so I had early years ago, I'd written a little nonprofit, or well, it was a nonprofit, but nonfiction book for the denomination that I work with. But while Trouble the Water was with the publisher and not yet out and ready to launch, I kind of had a dream like Barbara. I woke up thinking about my grandchildren and thinking, wouldn't it be just fun to write a story for them, or maybe even about them, because I want them. They're all readers, but I want them to think about what it means to be, courageous and bold and curious and all those things that we want for our children. And so while I was waiting for Trouble the Water to hit the shelves, I started working on a little book for the kids called Stars of Wonder, and it was a children's Christmas story about some curious siblings that follow a star and have an adventure and get lost, all those things. And it was a lot of fun. It didn't feel like work at all, which I think is another thing with writing. When it doesn't feel like work, it really, really flows. So now I'm working, if you can call it that, on a very messy women's fiction slash, it's autobiographically informed, but not autobiographical, and in part inspired by a bunch of high school girlfriends that got back together a few years ago. So a little bit Golden Girls meets Big Chill. But we're at this stage of life, this group that I was in high school with, who we're still kind of who we are, but more so, and but we've all had extraordinary experiences and victories and losses and heartaches and all the stuff of life. And when we got back together and began really kind of unwinding some of those and remembering some old things, the story started coming. I finally said, if you're not careful, I'm going to write about you. and they all thought that was a lot of fun. Yeah. So I, like I say, it's a big mess. I don't have a schedule for it right now. We're going through some other sort of more pressing issues in terms of family and life. And so it's on kind of a back burner, but I get to it when I can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, terribly, it is said that you're only as good as your last book, which is horrible. But
it's terrifying.
There is a lot of pressure on authors to keep going and to outdo yourself, and it's probably scary. I mean, if either one of you want to talk about, like, the fear factor of what's next.
It is. I didn't know what to expect with this novel, and it's been really nicely received, and book clubs are loving it, and I'm loving talking to them, and people are learning. I think one of the things I love about historical fiction is we really learn things, and it's opening these conversations because people are learning things that they just weren't in our own textbooks, sadly. So there is kind of an anxiety about, the next one. I don't want it to just be like, oh, she tried to write another book. So I'm certainly keeping my antennas up for that next um, extraordinary unknown story, because I love those personally.
Mhm.
Robert Smalls to me was an extraordinary unknown story, or little known. It was unknown to me. So I'm kind of keeping my ears open for that. But I do think there's a pressure and an anxiety to, if you've done something well or feel good about it once, you don't want the slippage to kick in.
I know, I know. And
So,
so, Barbara, you have your third one coming out, so your trilogy is done, but what next for you? Are you starting a whole new epic or?
well, the interesting thing is because I finished book one in 2008, and not to go in a large discussion on it, but what was book one then is now part of its book one and part of its book two. And I wrote a whole lot of extra stuff in there because of feedback I got going to writers group, pitching it to agents and so forth. So book three, just so you can get an idea, can you write a book in a short period of time? I wrote that 116,000 word book between July and October of this year.
Wow.
Yeah. But it was crazy, absolutely crazy. And I think it's the best of the three. I'll be honest with you. I love it. I absolutely love it. But here's the irony is obviously book one and two were done quite a while ago. So when I was pitching and querying, and by the way, over 50 rejections, thank you. When I was pitching and querying, people, they couldn't get past the drafts and things like that. So I was like, you know what? I have all these other story ideas. I just need to start writing something else. So when I pitched The Watchers of Manaya to Chris Kennedy Publishing, um, I didn't even plan to pitch that day. I was at a writing conference. I didn't realize there were vendors there that were publishers. And I overheard someone say, I pitched this publisher over there and they want to see my manuscript. I'm like, huh. So I pitched to all three publishers. And lo and behold, all three asked for the manuscript. And Chris from Chris Kennedy came back first. One of them came back and wanted it, but she didn't want to look at it if someone else was looking at the full. So she backed up. And then the other publisher was like, he's great. You should go with him because I can't talk to you for 18 months. So I was like, you know what? I've waited 12 years, I'm going to talk to this guy. So, but in that period when I was pitching it, I was writing other stuff. And I was deep into this story that's an urban fantasy, tentatively called Plunged in Purple. And I had to put it aside. My writing group is about to have a fit because I'm not bringing that to them right now. And I'm like, give me time, it's coming back. So that is, I'll probably start working on that again in the next few weeks. Right now, I'm trying to finalize edits on book three to make sure that that one's clean when it goes out.
Right.
But I write two blogs. Not only am I a corporate trainer, but I'm an instructional designer. So I develop training materials. And I have a course coming up at the end of February that I have not written yet. So I guess I'm going to be doing that. I write scripts for Bigger Brains, which is an online training company. Yeah, I'm too many irons in the fire sometimes.
You're busy, Barbara.
Yeah, I am, and I'm raising grandchildren, and yeah,
Oh.
so. But
For you.
I do the scripts have been several things got pushed aside for a while because I needed to write that trilogy, and so now I'm trying to pick those things back up. But I have at least 3 different storylines that I can create series on, and I'm
Wow.
so excited about them.
All right.
So, and I hadn't worried too much about if they were going to be as good as these or not, because I had begun to decide that maybe they were going to be my foot in the door as opposed to
Right.
The Watchers of Manaya.
Right.
So I'm excited about them. And really, I know the one that Plunged in Purple, I think it's going to be a really great one. So I saw Dodie say, do I have notes about those somewhere? I have the beginnings of all 3 of them. I have backstory on one of them, and I have roughly 50,000 words written in Plunged in Purple.
Oh, you guys are both busy. It's great to hear how this all plays out and how your mind is working and heading in the next direction. I know we all look forward to seeing what's coming. And I think Dodie wants to speak a moment, so I'm going to say goodbye again, and Dodie will take over.
Okay, that wasn't planned. This has been amazing. And your discussion about literacy, spot on with why Palmetto Literacy started. We opened our doors August 1st of 2019. Feel like, you know, we made it through the first year, and 9 months of that, you know, we're 15 months in, and 9 months of it was COVID. And we do our tutoring in the libraries because I have a special love for librarians. I think they're amazing. Never want to be one. I can't imagine my life without the library, quite honestly. For those of you, I know Betsy and Marianne, I want to thank you for your donations for this. This was awesome. I really appreciate it because we're running out of books. You mentioned the COVID and how it's impacting the students. And I have to tell you that we have a wait list of 12 kids. We have more adults coming in than we did before COVID. I think that's because there's nothing else to do. So maybe I should learn to read, which is awesome. But we just purchased some books to help. And most of our clients, and we've got clients from 5 to 55 years old. So we've got them coming in, prepping for getting up to the 6th grade reading level so that they can get into adult ed and get their GED. I do have somebody that said that they had a high school diploma and they're reading at the 4th grade level. I have another one who reads at the 1st grade level because he graduated. So we are constantly looking for volunteers. So any of you that are out there that would love to come and spend 2 hours a week with a student, I'm all in. If you know somebody, please let us know. Thank you both for your contributions. This is really, really cool. It always gets me
Thank you
stoked.
so much.
I have to tell you though, after I finished my dissertation, I was whipped for 3 weeks. I was over it. I've written plenty of articles since, but so this is encouraging to me that you're both so excited about writing, and it kind of spurs that on. I don't know if we've had any other questions. So I'd like to end this on a note, thanking both of you, thanking all of you that came. I know there's a young woman called Marilyn who couldn't get on. Her Zoom account was messing with her. So I'm going to send her the recording. And I will send Rebecca and Barbara recordings of this as well. Thank you. Thank you so much giving your time.
And I appreciate what you're doing and the opportunity to just be here and team up with you. And if I lived near where you were, I would definitely be interested in doing that. So I'm up here in the upstate. I'm sure there's a counterpart up here. So if you know of someone, let me know.
Okay, I sure will.
Well, and I echo that, Dodie and Patricia, both thank you for what you do and the clients that you serve. And just know that, I know particularly right now that there's a lot of difficulty in that, but it makes a difference. And we thank you for that.
It does.
We really do.
Patricia, I want to thank you for putting this on and getting in touch with Barbara and Rebecca. These are phenomenal authors. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for this. Keep writing.
Yes.
Thanks, Paul.
Yes.
Your
Your stories are great.
Talk
All right,
soon.
we're gonna end now. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in a couple of months.
Absolutely.
All right,
We'll be back.
all
Have a
right,
Bye,
nice
everyone.
day. Bye-bye.
bye-bye.